Welcome to Euractiv's Tech Brief podcast. My name is Luca Bertuzzi, your technology editor. This week, we take a closer look at the DSA and at what companies will have to do to comply with it. For an overview on all things technology related in the EU, sign up to our free newsletter or visit the website euractiv.com. This is Euractiv's Tech Brief podcast. Today, I'm joined by Louis-Victor de Franssu, co-founder of Tremau, a startup. Hello, Louis-Victor.
Hello, Luca.
Louis-Victor, you have been working as Chief of Staff of the French Digital Ambassador in a key time for digital policy in Europe. Can you tell us more about your experience?
Thank you very much. Thanks for the question, and thank you again for having me here today. I joined Henri Verdier, the French ambassador for digital affairs team in early 2019 when he was just building his office. He was the second French ambassador for digital affairs, but the first one to have a full team around him. His role was to concentrate and push France's vision around the digital world in around four specific fields. One which was security, the second was human rights, the third was economical diplomacy, and the fourth was internet governance. And I focus more on the security part, which had two aspects, of course, which had cybersecurity, but also had how do we fight against any foreign or even domestic threats that can happen online. So terrorist content, disinformation, etc. And little by little, I started concentrating on the Christchurch call to action after the French president and the New Zealand prime minister decided to launch the call following the horror we witnessed in Christchurch in 2019.
Yeah, so from looking at the security aspect of the online world, you then also worked on the DSA. And now, if I got that right, you have decided to make the DSA your business model. How did that play out?
There was a couple of elements that came. First, one thing I didn't mention is that before joining the French administration and the French ambassador for digital affairs, I worked for many years in the financial world where I was working in compliance risk management. And as we were negotiating or discussing with many of the online platforms around how do you fight against this terrorist content online or how do you fight against disinformation online, I kept drawing parallels between some of the risk mitigation frameworks that we had helped some of the largest banks in the world put in place and what we were seeing, some of the elements that we believed should be put in place by these companies, the first of which was transparency reports. I remember I participated in a number of discussions around, what are some of the metrics that governments want or regulators want to see from the platforms in order to ensure that they are doing their best to fight against what's illegal online, but also that they are protecting fundamental human rights. And there was also always a discussion around, is the information that is required personal identification information, PII? It was our belief in France that actually we do not need that type of information. What is really necessary in terms of transparency is to be able to understand the entire process of the content moderation that these companies are using. How many times do they receive notifications? From whom? For what reason? What do they do upon it? Are there complaints? All these different elements, which enabled a regulator to much better understand what was happening on this platform, what were some of the weaknesses or strengths of the platform, and how the moderation process was working. We pushed this for a number of years in 2019 and 2020. And then the Digital Services Act came, which we followed from the office, but we weren't involved in the day-to-day French task force, but we followed what was being discussed. And what I was really amazed with this proposal is that it really, what the Commission had prepared, really followed this idea of transparency and the transparency of the entire moderation process for companies. Now, one of the arguments we kept hearing when discussing with the big companies, if I go back to the work I was doing, was that it was going to be very difficult for small and medium-sized companies to be able to produce these transparency reports because they were requiring the right processes and the right tools. And again, I kept thinking to what I was doing in the banking world, which is exactly this. We were working with tool providers that were implementing tools to help the banks do their, for example, anti-money laundering processes. And this is what we build at Tremau. What we build at Tremau is this idea that it is possible to be compliant with these new regulations only if you have the tools and processes that enable you to do so. And the tools and processes don't need to be outrageously expensive, and you don't need to build them in-house. You can outsource it to software developers. And we at Tremau were the first to focus specifically on this part of the problem, rather than on the detecting part, which in fact is not mandatory in the regulation.
This parallel with the financial world is very interesting, and it's actually perhaps the first time I hear about it. So, in concrete terms, when you say that this process can be externalized and that you aim to provide tools, what are we talking about in concrete? What sort of support can you provide to companies to ensure that they comply with the DSA?
One of the challenges we notice is a company is going to grow. Let's say an online platform that's growing. Okay, it's going to have multiple phases in its growth. It's going to have the time where it has 2,000 users, and then 500,000 users, and then 1 million users, and then maybe 10 million users. It's growing, and so the support it needs to do the content moderation and the tools that are needed for it are going to be very different. One thing is going to always be the same is that in terms of the steps, is that they need to have the capacity to have a human in the loop, so to have the right screens, for example, very easily, so that a human moderator can review the content. They need to be able to treat law enforcement requests very quickly on the appropriate screens. They need to be able, with the Digital Service Act, to respond to trusted flaggers. And they will need to do so following a certain dashboard, following a risk-based approach. So you don't want to keep, a bit what we saw in 2019 during the Haller attack, where it took a number of hours for a social media company to remove the video because they had a first in, first out approach, rather than having the approach which consisted of saying, what is the risk of this video? And so if the risk is high, i.e. it's live stream, it's been reported for terrorists, it's been reported for live violence, it should be the first content I review, my moderators review in my moderation queue, moderation list. So that's just one aspect. And then, of course, depending on what content it is, if it's child sexual abuse material, then you need to send it to NECMEC or to the authorities. If it's terrorist content, then you maybe want to send it to the GIFCT, or with the TCO regulation, you'll need to send it to Europol. And there's a number of different elements that you need to do, which again, if you're a small or medium company, building all these connections and creating your trust and safety ecosystem is going to be particularly difficult and expensive. Now, what we provide is this workflow, a bit like a plug and play workflow, where we provide the dashboards and all these different steps for the company as they do the moderation process. And this includes integrating all the data feeds that they are receiving from across the board. So I mentioned, of course, law enforcement requests, trusted flagger notices, user notices, but also as these companies grow, they use more and more detection tools. But a lot of these detection tools are actually creating a lot of false positive that need to be reviewed by humans, and these reviews need to be done on the screen. And either they can, and if they want to centralize all this process, so to be able to facilitate the publication of transparency reports at the end of the year, then they will need to do it on a centralized dashboard or through the same system. And again, this is what we provide. And now, when on top of this, which is what some of the largest companies have been doing until today, but the smallest haven't, or on a much smaller scale, you add to this the complaint mechanism. So once you remove a content, you need to be able, not just delete it, but you need to be able to send the possibility to your user to do a complaint, and then have a new moderator review the case, understand what happened at the first step, not just see the complaint itself. So all of this needs to be done, as I was mentioning, in a proper workflow, in a proper tool, with the proper power around it. And again, in order to be transparent at the end of the year. Now, if I go back to the first element I was saying, which is, imagine you're growing, then the speed and the scale of the tool in place is going to be very different. And by the way, the regulations is also evolving, and it's evolving in different ways across the globe. So if you're a company that's growing and you're growing in different markets, either you need to redo that tool on a yearly basis and try to and have to adapt it, have to scale it, have to rethink it, or you outsource it to a provider that does that for you. And this is exactly what we offer.
Most of the discussion on the DSA were focused on the VLOPs, the very large online platforms. If I understand your work correctly, you're mostly focusing on SMEs or platforms that are scaling up. Besides what you just mentioned, are there some additional challenges for these smaller companies in their compliance effort with the new regulation?
Yes, there will be a number of other challenges. There's a number of elements around ad transparency. There's a number of elements around protection of minors online. And then there's a lot of information. Again, it's related to the workflow, but the ability to provide the right information and to respond to trusted flaggers. There's a lot of these obligations that are coming for the SMEs. And you're right, we've been focusing very much on the VLOPs because they're the very large ones. But in terms of scale or number of companies, if you look at the VLOPs, there's probably going to be maybe 15, 20. I don't know how many companies are over 45 million monthly users. And by the way, this is something which the Commission is going to have to help us also understand how what is a monthly user? How do you count it? What's what are the metrics that you actually use to calculate it? But then, if you believe that there's over 10,000 companies that are impacted by the Digital Services Act, then the vast majority of the companies impacted are SMEs, and they are the ones that, in fact, have done up to today have had the less means or the less have invested the less in these trust and safety programs or content moderation processes, simply because it wasn't an obligation for them. And these companies are today, focusing on scaling rather than focusing simply on this part, which of course is crucial.
Moving on to the VLOPs now, because when we talk about very large online platforms, we always think about Facebook, about Google, but in fact there are large platforms that are not as profitable. Take Wikipedia, for example, or there are likely to be a lot of porn websites also categorized as VLOPs. What sort of challenges are they facing in terms of compliance, since they will have much stricter obligations under the DSA?
So these companies are going to have part of the some of the most challenging elements are going to be around the risk assessments analysis, and consequently the risk mitigation plans that they need to put in place. That I think is going to be key for a lot of these companies, because we'll go a bit further in some of the other elements that they, or some of the other requirements. But these risk assessments today, there's no methodology that's been developed, and or only the very beginning of these methodologies. And now the Commission is requiring them to do this on a yearly basis and to be able to publish a risk mitigation plans. And I think a lot of these VLOPs are kind of looking at some advice, saying, okay, what does this mean? What does this entail for my business? And how do I actually achieve this risk assessments? But that's not the only issue. I mean, a lot of these companies, there's also transparency around advertising, which is going to be some challenging for some of these companies. There's a lot of elements around the choice of recommender systems, which is also something which is not natural for some of these companies. I mean, some of the online platforms are quite advanced on this, some are not at all. And as you were mentioning, some platforms on which we go, for example, porn sites, we never realized, or they're never seen as kind of networks or as online platforms, when in fact they behave in a way which is very similar to YouTube. And YouTube is, in our unconscious, we do believe, we do naturally tend to put YouTube as a VLOP and not some of the porn sites. So it is indeed going to be very interesting to see how these companies adapt, and how these companies adapt to also being a bit more in the spotlight. because they are going to have to publish transparency reports as well. They are going to have to be much more transparent in how they finance themselves through advertising, et cetera, et cetera.
You mentioned a couple of times already that the Commission has to release guidance on how to interpret some of the most fundamental aspects of the DSA, such as the risk assessment. Can you give us an overview of what we're waiting from the Commission at this stage of the DSA, and what are perhaps the most significant elements that the Commission has to provide?
That is indeed a very good question, and it's a question that a lot of companies are waiting for an answer to, and not only a lot of companies, but also a lot of digital service coordinators. A lot of them are, I know, also waiting for some advice on where to go from the Commission. I don't have a date. I don't work at the Commission, and I don't have a date, or I don't have an expectation of the timeline. What I do know is that there's a number of elements where the Commission has said already in the text that they may propose guidance, which means that they probably will. And these include, for example, what needs to be included in complaint mechanisms. I think guidance is mentioned, several times in the actual DSA itself, around protection for minors, around the codes of conduct, around the trusted flaggers. So there's a number of these guidance that will be published. And they will be published for some, high level, but also for some very detailed. For example, what does the Commission consider as independent for trusted flag organization? What does it mean? If a trusted flag organization, which often are NGOs or non-profit organizations that are often financed by subsidies from companies, does that mean that that NGO is independent from a platform or not? And these are types of the guidance, for example, that the Commission will have to provide in order for both both the trusted flaggers themselves, but also the national regulators or the digital service coordinators for them to be able to comply and implement the DSA as it's supposed to be, and also in a way that is harmonized across the Union. If I just for a minute compare again to what we saw in the financial industry, these different levels of implementing standards are very common. You have a law that's written by the Commission, then you have ESMA that will, or actually the European Banking Authority that's going to issue some guidance, and then ESMA is going to issue some implementing standards, which is kind of the third level. I don't believe that for the first version of the DSA is going to be as complex as what we see in the financial world today, but I think that little by little it is going to evolve, and we are going to see more and more guidance and more precise information being provided by the Commission as to how these requirements need to be implemented, and how digital service coordinators need also to regulate online platforms' presence in their countries. I'll add this. What's interesting is platforms are, of course, waiting for these guidance. Trusted flaggers are, but digital service coordinators are as well. And so there is a big weight from all different actors around more information as to how we actually implement the Digital Services Act. And the time frame is quite short, because if the DSA is to be adopted in October, which is what is the time frame that is today being discussed or published officially, that means that VLOPs will be regulated by very early of next year, very early 2023. So that gives very little time for both the regulators, but also for the Commission to be able to actually define some of the guidance, help the companies with, for example, the risk assessments. What are some of the elements that need to be assessed? What are the different main areas that the Commission is looking to for answers to, etc.
And indeed, the next months will be crucial to determine how the DSA will shape up in practice. Thank you, Louis-Victor de Franssu, co-founder of Tremau, and I hope we will hear back from you once we know more about the implementation of the DSA.
Thank you very much, Luca. It was great to speak to you and to speak more about this subject, which is so crucial today.
That's all we got time for this week. Don't forget to sign up to our free Tech Brief newsletter to stay on top of tech news and digital policy development in the EU and beyond. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast, published on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and Amazon Music. This episode was produced with the technical help of Avi Chiori. I'm your Luca Bertuzzi, and thank you for listening.